The floors never creaked outside that chamber. The stone beneath the tapestries stayed colder than the rest of the palace, even in late summer, even when the fires were lit. Servants passed with lowered eyes. They carried nothing. They knocked on no doors, and when asked, they forgot how to speak. Winchester Palace was never meant to be silent. It was the heart of Henry's court, where justice was declared, alliances forged, banners raised. Yet there was one room, beyond the throne, behind a carved wooden door trimmed in iron vines, where justice never entered. Inside, only the king did, and sometimes, boys. Hugh of Bar was 11 when he entered service. Small for his age, with golden curls that tangled at the nape of his neck, he was chosen not for his sword arm but for his obedience. They dressed him in soft wool, stitched a lion crest to his tunic, and warned him never to speak unless spoken to. The king, they told him, favoured quiet boys. He was summoned once at nightfall, then again the next evening, then every week. The other pages noticed. So did the guards who looked away. So did the Queen. Eleanor of Aquitaine, regal in green velvet, watched from a high window one night, watched her husband's figure disappear behind the carved door, Hugh trailing in silence, fingers trembling near the lion embroidered over his heart. She never asked where they went, never asked what was done behind the crown's veil. The fire in that chamber was always kept low, cold, as though heat would reveal something it should not. The sheets were white silk, changed more often than in any other royal bed. The maids whispered of stains that never came out, of the way the king demanded quiet, always quiet, as he dismissed them with a glance. Once, a chambermaid found a drop of red on the hem of Hugh's sleeve. Not a wound, just colour, just memory. It was never spoken of again. If this was the world for boys near power, what did it mean for the rest of England's children? If silence protected kings, who protected them? After that year, Hugh stopped laughing. He flinched when anyone raised their voice. He slept with his boots on, afraid of the summons in the dark. The lion crest began to peel from his tunic. No one replaced it. He was reassigned quietly to kitchen duty. A month later, a new boy wore the lion. No royal record survives of Hugh's reassignment, but his name appears once more in the Queen's personal ledger. Just a note, a single line. Returned linens, burned. Winchester's throne room still stands, but the chamber behind it was sealed after Henry's death, bricked over. Tapestries hung in front of it as though it had never been there. But if you press your ear to the wall, some say you can still hear the rustle of silk and the breath of boys who forgot how to cry. She arrived beneath a veil too long for her height. 12 years old, Princess Alice of France was draped in blue silk and perfumed with orange water, sent not as a child, but as a promise. Her marriage to Prince Richard was meant to bind kingdoms, calm decades of war, and silence distrust between England and France. Instead, she disappeared behind Henry's walls. Westminster Abbey's guest wing was prepared for royalty. Tapestries hung thick to warm the chill of early spring. Servants were instructed to treat Alice not as a child, but as a queen in waiting. And yet no wedding took place. No ceremony was planned. No dowry was counted aloud, because the king, Henry II, 40 years old, fierce and cunning, had claimed the girl for his keeping. He said it was for protection, for diplomacy, for the sake of peace. But the Queen knew better. Eleanor of Aquitaine had seen it before, the way Henry smiled without warmth, the way he dismissed female attendants and appointed only his most silent guards to Alice's chamber. The same guards who once stood outside Eleanor's own door years ago, when she too had been young and useful. The first maid disappeared in April, the second in May. By June, No one was allowed into Alice's room without a writ bearing the king's seal. The girl grew quieter each week. Her French grew hesitant, her English halting. She no longer asked when Richard would arrive. She no longer braided her hair. By 13, Alice had stopped speaking altogether. The chapel was prepared twice, once for her betrothal, and again when the king claimed the delay was due to illness. Each time she was dressed in ivory lace and led through the abbey in silence. Each time the veil was heavier. Torn slightly along one edge, it snagged on the edge of the pew as she passed. No one reached to fix it. The abbey priest later recalled her as hollow-eyed but obedient. Richard, her intended groom, was away in Aquitaine. When he returned 2 years later, he refused to marry her. No reason was given, no scandal was spoken. But the Queen, Eleanor, kept the torn veil, folded it, placed it in a chest with other things the court wished to forget. Alice lived in the palace for another decade, hidden in full view, her title unused. No portrait was commissioned, no letters survive, only a single note in the abbey's linen records. Dresses altered, chest resealed, girl unclaimed. She was never crowned, never wed, never sent home. They say she walked the gardens in the early hours, barefoot, her eyes unfocused, her hands clasped as if in prayer. No one dared ask what she'd seen, and when she passed years later, not one bell rang in France. In the abbey where her wedding was once promised, the torn veil remains locked behind a reliquary. Not because she was sainted, but because no one could bear to throw it away. The lion meant something different to the boys. They were told it was a badge of honour stitched in gold thread onto deep blue tunics, worn just below the heart. To serve the king as a page was to begin the long climb toward knighthood. To wear the lion was to be chosen. Hugh of Bar had earned his crest by silence. At 11, he was quicker than the other boys, quieter too. His golden curls never quite obeyed the comb, and his hands were always folded, even when no one was watching. The steward liked that, said he was fit for chamber duty, said the king preferred boys who didn't ask questions. The first summons came at dusk. The king, Henry II, restless and sharp-eyed, had returned from hunting. Mud still clung to his boots. He didn't look at Hugh when he entered, only motioned once toward the private chamber with the narrow fire and the thick curtains drawn shut. The lion on Hugh's chest caught the light for just a moment before the door closed. Afterward, the boy didn't speak for 2 days. When William Marshal passed him in the hall, a seasoned knight, silent protector to princes, he paused, looked at the boy's uneven breath, the loosened collar, the new hesitation in his step. William said nothing, only placed a hand on Hugh's shoulder, firm but useless. He knew what the lion meant now. It was never mentioned in court. But the servants whispered of certain boys being moved closer to the king's quarters, of tunics returned with torn seams as though they'd been pulled off too fast, of boys like Hugh who began to flinch when the hour grew late and the castle grew quiet. One night, a letter was found slipped beneath the bishop's door. It was unsigned, written in a child's hand. It said, "I serve the king well. Why am I still afraid?" The bishop burned it. By winter, Hugh had stopped sleeping indoors. He trained outside, even in the rain. His once prized tunic, lion crest and all, was folded at the foot of his cot, untouched for weeks. He wore a plain brown shirt instead, said it was easier to move in. No one corrected him. He was never summoned again. And then one morning the lion was gone, torn cleanly from the blue fabric, the thread still dangling like veins pulled from flesh. The tunic remained, folded, now empty of meaning. The king never asked what became of the boy. William Marshal found Hugh months later, polishing armour alone. He knelt beside him, picked up the torn crest from the floor, looked at it for a long time. Neither spoke. The silence was heavier than any sword. At the year's end, the steward recorded that Hugh had been reassigned to stable duty. No reason given, but for the rest of his life, he never wore the lion again, and no other boy kept theirs for long. The corridors never echoed the way they once did. In Aquitaine, Eleanor of Aquitaine had ruled with fire in her voice and dust on her riding boots. Now, in the stone-wrapped hush of Winchester's upper galleries, she moved like breath through velvet. She slept alone, not because she chose to, but because the king, Henry II, her husband, had stopped asking questions he didn't want answered. His nights belonged to other rooms now, the ones with no witnesses, the ones with heavy wooden doors. She never asked what happened behind them, but she watched. At dusk she would sit before the mirror. Her hair, now streaked with silver, was still braided tight like a queen, her emerald velvet gown laid flat with care. The mirror before her bore a single crack down the centre, clean and slender, like a knife slipped between ribs. She stared at her reflection each night until the candle burned low. And in the glass, she saw the hallway behind her, the one that led to the king's chamber, the door, always shut, always glowing at the edges as though the secrets inside couldn't quite be contained. She said nothing, but her son, Geoffrey, had begun to speak. At 14, Geoffrey was clever and sharp-eyed, like a blade that had never known rest. He watched his father's movements, watched which boys were promoted, which letters were burned, which names disappeared from the household rolls. He asked his mother once, softly in the early hours when the palace still slept, "Why do we pretend not to know?" Eleanor didn't answer. She only placed her brush down beside the cracked mirror and blew out the candle. She knew the cost of knowing, knew what it meant to speak too soon, to move too fast, to be a queen in a world that called you wife when convenient and prisoner when not. She had once led armies, now she led silence. The court still bowed when she entered, but their eyes avoided hers. Geoffrey noticed that too, and in his silence something else grew, something harder than grief. She watched him linger near the royal scribes. She watched him begin to draft letters in a hand too mature for his age. She watched the same way she had watched Henry, carefully, quietly. The door remained shut, but she knew the sound it made when it closed. It was the same sound that lived at the back of her throat behind every word she didn't say. Not yet. The candles in Canterbury never burned bright enough to chase away guilt. Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, once stood shoulder to shoulder with Henry, laughing in council chambers, drafting decrees, exchanging confidences like brothers. But time had dulled their bond, and something darker had begun to whisper between them. It began with names, servants, pages, a girl with a French veil who never spoke again. Becket heard the rumours in the corridors of the cathedral. Hushed voices, hesitant steps, the kind of silence that carries more weight than words. At first he dismissed them. Court gossip, discontent, the usual poison that brewed near power. But then William Marshall came to confession. The knight said little, only spoke of a lion crest torn from a child's tunic, of a boy who trembled when touched, of chamber doors that closed too quietly. Becket said nothing in return, only reached for his crucifix beneath his robes, smooth silver shaped to comfort, and twisted it once in his hand. The next day, he met with the king. Henry II greeted him in the royal council chamber, fire crackling behind his throne, eyes alert as ever. He asked Becket about church reforms, about loyalty, about silence. Becket answered every question, except the one that wasn't spoken. He did not mention the boys, he did not mention the broken crest, He didn't speak Alice's name. Instead, he spoke of prayer, of divine order, of obedience. And when Henry smiled, Becket forced himself to nod. That night, the archbishop stood alone in the cathedral's eastern apse. The air was thick with incense. His voice echoed off stone, hollow and rehearsed. He pressed the crucifix to his lips, not in devotion, but in desperation, because he knew what it meant to cross Henry. He had once been the king's mirror. Now he feared becoming his shadow. Weeks passed, and more pages were reassigned. One servant, a boy barely 12, was found praying beside the altar, eyes wide, lips moving with no sound. He had bruises on his wrists and no memory of how they got there. Becket sent him home, quietly, without inquiry. It was easier to bless than to accuse, easier to preach against sin than name the sinner in the crown. The silver crucifix twisted tighter each day in his palm. Its edges began to leave marks, and then Henry accused him of treason, not for protecting children, but for protecting the church. The irony was not lost on him. When Becket finally fell, murdered on the steps of his own cathedral, it was not only blood that soaked the stones, it was everything he never said. He had his father's eyes, but not his loyalty. Geoffrey of Brittany, 17, was the overlooked son, the one not destined for a throne, not beloved by a kingdom, not weighed down by expectation, which meant no one watched him closely, not even the king. Henry II had always kept Geoffrey at arm's length. The crown favoured Richard's sword and John's future. Geoffrey was given parchment, not power, ink instead of steel. But Geoffrey read everything. He read the household rosters, noticed which names disappeared without cause. He read discarded letters, noticed who wrote in fear. He read the expressions of the boys in the halls, the nervous ones, the ones who never stayed long. And he remembered Alice, the French princess who was meant to marry Richard, but never did, who sat year after year like a ghost in silk, her name rarely spoken, her presence barely acknowledged. But Geoffrey saw her. He saw the way she flinched when footsteps passed too close, the way her veil slipped from her shoulders as if trying to escape, the way the king never looked at her, but always knew exactly where she stood. Geoffrey stored it all, and when the time came, he opened the strategy chamber's door with steady hands. Henry looked up from the royal map, territories inked in red, castles marked in gold. His crown sat beside the goblet. He barely acknowledged his son. "You're early," the king said. Geoffrey didn't respond. He crossed the room and held up a small piece of silver-backed glass, once part of the Queen's dressing mirror. Cracked now, the surface spidered with the lines that fractured his reflection. He placed it gently atop the map, right across Brittany. Henry's brow furrowed. "What is this?" "A truth you keep pretending doesn't exist," Geoffrey said. The king rose, his voice grew sharp. "Mind your tongue." But Geoffrey was past fear. "I've written letters to 3 courts," he said. "They don't name you directly yet, but the rumours are spreading." Henry stepped forward, slow, heavy. "You'd tear your own house down?" Geoffrey met his gaze. "It was never my house. You just locked me in it." Silence. Candlelight flickered against the glass. The broken mirror glinted red over the map, blood-like in the shadows. Outside the chamber, Eleanor stood in the hallway, her gown pressed to the stone wall. She didn't enter. She didn't intervene. But her eyes stayed fixed on the closed door. She had seen this coming, not because she willed it, but because boys raised in silence always learn to scream without sound. When Geoffrey left the room, he left the mirror behind. The map was still beneath it, but the crown was no longer beside the goblet. It had been swept to the floor, and one of its points now bent, just slightly, like a blade used too often, in the dark. Chinon Castle stood quiet in the summer of 1189. No fanfare, no heralds, just a hush that had settled over the stone-like dust, seeping into tapestries, echoing in corridors that once knew footsteps well. The king was dying, and no one came to weep. Henry II lay curled beneath a woolen shroud, breath shallow, eyes dimmed by pain and rot. The fever had taken his voice. The crown had taken everything else. The chamber was cold, not from the weather, but from absence. No sons by his side, no queen to hold his hand, only priests muttering prayers they could not feel, crossing themselves over a man who had crossed every line. The crown rested on a velvet pillow beside him, its gold dulled, one point bent from where it had fallen years before. It had never been repaired. He wouldn't let them. A servant came to dampen his forehead. Hugh of Bar, now grown, 30 years old, with the quiet walk of someone who had learned long ago how to disappear. His eyes were shadowed. His voice never rose above a whisper. He did not speak the king's name, only placed the cloth on his brow and waited. Henry didn't recognize him. He hadn't, not once, in all the years since Hugh returned to court as a chamberlain. Another faceless functionary, another body in silence. But Hugh remembered. The linen sheets that never stayed white, the lion crest that once clung to his chest, the words he had once written and burned. He remembered everything. And when the king coughed, a wet, rasping sound, Hugh reached not for the goblet, but for the crown, not to place it on Henry's head, but to take it away. The gold was warm from the fire, but light, lighter than it should have been, lighter than the weight it once carried. A fracture ran through the base now, thin like a crack in ice. He turned it once in his hand, and saw, just faintly, his own reflection. A boy's eyes, buried beneath a man's face. When Henry finally stirred, his lips parted as if to speak, but no words came, only breath, thin, fading. Across the room, one of the priests whispered a final rite. Outside, the river kept moving. No horns were blown, no mourning cloth hung. The Queen did not return. Geoffrey never sent word, and when the crown slipped from Henry's hand onto the stone floor, no one moved to catch it. It landed with a sound that should have echoed, but didn't. Not here, not now. Later, they would write that Henry died peacefully, that the room was solemn, that the throne was preserved. But Hugh knew better. So did the walls, and so did the boy who once watched the door close. The chamber behind the throne had long since been sealed. The tapestries still hung to hide it, but in some parts of the court, the servants still glance at that wall, as if it might open again, as if the past buried beneath silk and silence was not done speaking.